that honors Texans who, according to the guidelines of our foundation, represent the best traditions of civic involvement and enlightened philanthropy. And in a few minutes, it's going to be my honor and privilege to present that award to Maureen and Robert Decherd. But before I do that, I want to tell you about this outstanding couple that we're honoring today. Much of this will be familiar to you, but it certainly is an occasion to illuminate it again. Robert Decherd, of course, is a lifelong resident of Dallas. Robert grew up in a newspaper family, and for 40 years of his adult life, he devoted his life's work to the news business and to journalism. As a youth, Robert excelled at St. Mark's School here in Dallas, and he was editor of the school newspaper. And following St. Mark's, he attended Harvard and was graduated there in 1973, and along the way was elected by his peers as president of the Harvard Crimson. In 1973, after his graduation from Harvard, Robert came back to Dallas and went to work as a management trainee at A.H. Belo Corporation, which of course was the owner and publisher of the Dallas Morning News and is to this day. During his management training days, Robert worked as a reporter at the News. Now, Robert rose rapidly to become a senior executive of Belo, and in the early 1980s, he played leading roles in the company going public and in the company greatly expanding its presence in television broadcasting. In 1987, Robert became chairman and chief executive officer of Belo Corporation, and under his leadership, Belo became one of the country's foremost media companies. It owned and operated not only the Dallas Morning News and WFA-TV here in Dallas, but major daily newspapers on the West and East Coasts. And it came to own 20 major market television stations, reaching 1/3 of the nation's households. All the while, Robert served as chairman of Belo and its spin-off newspaper company until he retired from full-time employment last year. Under his leadership, Belo became renowned for truly great local journalism. During his watch, the Dallas Morning News won 9 Pulitzer Prizes, and Belo TV stations won 21 DuPont Columbia Awards. One of those DuPont Awards was a gold baton presented to WFA-TV, the only such recognition ever for a local TV station in the long history of the DuPont Awards conducted by Columbia. Now, Robert's wisest choice as an adult was uniting in marriage with Maureen Healy. Maureen is a 1973 graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, and among many other civic endeavors, she has been particularly active in serving her alma mater, the University of Texas. She served on the UT Liberal Arts Advisory Council and the university's Commission of 125. This was a group that was chartered to envision the future of the university, to give you some idea of the esteem that the university holds Maureen in. Maureen and Robert's greatest success in life has been raising 2 outstanding children, William and Audrey. Maureen's civic involvement includes her service as president of the Decherd Foundation. And the Decherd Foundation has generously supported education and human services since its establishment in 1993. Most recently, the Decherd Foundation, as well as Maureen and Robert individually, were instrumental in the creation of one of the great jewels of downtown Dallas, Belo Garden. Robert and Maureen, along with the Maroney family and the Belo Foundation, were the lead donors for the Belo Center for New Media at the University of Texas, which opened in 2012. The Belo Center houses the UT College of Communication and our own Wanda Cash. Where is Wanda? There she is, who was on the faculty there. Now, I could stop right now, and already what I have cited would be ample reasons for Robert and Maureen to be recognized with a prestigious award for civic virtue. But, as they say on late night television, there's much, much more. So let me go back again, if I might, to the beginning, at least that is to the beginning of the Freedom of Information Foundation. In 1978, Robert was a young executive at Belo, he was known even at that time as an innovator in the newspaper business, a forward thinker, a person who saw the big picture that lay in the future and made plans to not only to embrace it, but to improve it. One day in 1978, Robert had a meeting with a few of his trusted colleagues. Now, I wasn't present for this meeting 36 years ago. I was a wee lad then. And we have no notes from this momentous event. There's no recording that's known to exist of that meeting, but I've done recently some intense investigative reporting about that meeting. And I've gathered some information from some highly reliable sources, and I can report today that the dialogue that occurred at this meeting, and it might have gone something like this, and I emphasize might. I'm quoting here, perhaps a little bit loosely, but as we say in the legal profession, the gist is substantially true here. So Robert is meeting with his colleagues one day in 1973, and he says to them, I want to start a new foundation. And so colleague number one looks over at Robert and says, great idea, Robert. There's so much good that a foundation under your leadership and with the support of Velo Corporation could do for the people in Dallas and for the people in the state of Texas. And then so colleague number two speaks up, says Robert, I know you care deeply about education and making educational opportunity available for more of our young citizens. Will this new nonprofit, will it be dedicated to education? Robert replied, no, that's not what I had in mind. Next up to speak is colleague number three, and he has a very puzzled look on his face at this point. He says, Robert, I know you're an admirer of great architecture and efforts to improve the modern urban environment. How about a foundation to support city planning and parks development? Robert shakes his head, no. So colleague number one jumps back into the discussion, says, Robert, I know you've been an active supporter of the Dallas Symphony. You must be planning a foundation to support the arts, right? Robert responds, no, the arts are a worthy cause, and so is education, and so is city planning. Those are certainly the sort of things I want to devote my time and talent and money to. But I have a different kind of foundation in mind, a foundation that will be dedicated to freedom of information. A long pause ensues in the room. Robert's companions are now truly puzzled. Colleague number one speaks up again, says, I'm sorry, did you say you want to create a Freedom of Information Foundation? And Robert replies, yes, that's exactly what I have in mind. Then Robert explained to his colleagues, the Freedom of Information Foundation will be dedicated to an idea. It is an idea as old as the American Republic. It is the idea that James Madison had in mind when Madison said, knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. This foundation will be dedicated to the people's right to know, the right to know what the government is doing in the public's name and with their tax dollars. With that beginning, Robert created something totally new. Now, to be sure, in 1978, of course, we did have nonprofit foundations. That wasn't new. And by 1978, we were in the second decade of the federal law known as the Freedom of Information Act. And this was the post-Vietnam, post-Watergate era. Leaders and journalists and ordinary citizens were really taking seriously the need for a public accountability of public officials. And by 1978, many states, including Texas, had enacted open records statutes, state-level versions of the federal FOI Act. Also by 1978, there had been press groups and media coalitions that were attempting to spread the gospel of freedom of information. But these were ad hoc efforts, often transitory, often temporary, here today, gone tomorrow. No one had yet ever joined the idea of freedom of information with the idea of a foundation. No one had ever been a bold enough thinker to envision a foundation, a perpetual nonprofit corporation, whose mission would be to promote, protect, and expand freedom of information. But Robert Decherd had that vision. Robert understood the need for an organized effort to protect the public's right to open and transparent government. He understood that news reporters, as surrogates for the public, needed to be trained and educated on how to use FOI laws for public interest journalism. Robert served as the first president of the foundation from 1978 to 1981. He soon made another bold stroke to make the foundation a permanent institution. Robert arranged for Belo Corporation to provide $150,000 in seed money funding over a 3-year period in the mid-1980s. That seed money funding allowed the foundation to hire its first full-time paid staff member. Nancy Monson became our first executive director, and she moved into her permanent office in the newly constructed at that time Belo building, which of course is just a very short distance from where we gather today. And the space on that office was arranged rent-free through Robert Decherd. Now, another important step in the growth of the foundation from startup institution to from a startup to a real institution was continuity in leadership. So it's my great honor and personal privilege to present to Maureen and Robert Decherd the John Henry Falk Award for Civic Virtue.
There is no rebuttal. Paul, thank you for that very elegant introduction and a reminder of why we're all here today. I particularly like the analogy to George Washington. Some of you don't know that I actually planted a cherry tree in the center stripe of the parking lot over there that's at risk. Because that's, they have a decision to make. Are they going to preserve the cherry tree or not? So I expect all of the current Beloites to be out there saving that tree, along with Paula Lambert and her, whatever it is, and Steve Bellum. We can make this an event as we go. But very seriously, Maureen and I greatly appreciate this recognition, and I hope, as all of you have already deduced, we purposefully ask that this be a smaller event where the core group, the people who really made this possible, to be together in a more informal setting than the big bashes that we have historically used to not only to promote the foundation but to award this award. And some of those have been quite grand. When we awarded this to the hobbies in the early 2000s, Dolph Briscoe and I were recruited to send out a letter to the 5,000, and we ended up with this enormous event at the Bullock Museum in Austin, which had just opened. Those of you who know Maureen and me know that's not our cup of tea to begin with, but it would have overwhelmed this opportunity to get all of you together to celebrate what the foundation's accomplished over a very long period of time. So I'm very grateful to Diana and the foundation for acceding to our wishes and doing it in this manner. As Paul pointed out, the foundation really has had wonderful success over a long period of time. The total endowment now is almost $2 million. A substantial part of that came from the gift he mentioned that we made in, I think, 1996, Kelly. I did look that up. And that was essentially to get us out of the annual support business, because we not only had Nancy ensconced over in the Belo building. As I told her earlier, she was one of the chief nomads, because every time we changed the building around, the foundation would move. It was not exactly at the top of the pecking order, sorry. But we were giving annual support in a cash grant. And as we looked at how this might play out over the long term, and we saw more support from organizations around the state, it became evident that if we could create this endowed model, it would ensure that we could perpetuate the purposes of the foundation for a long time. And I want Dunya and Dan and others to put their hands over their ears, but you may remember we actually made a cash gift of $800,000. I know, okay. To create that endowment, and it's slightly more than that today. But the other funds have come from the hard work of several boards successively to put all this together, and it's I'm not sure that I'd say it's unique, but it's highly unusual in terms of how these matters are addressed in states around the country or even on a national basis. There are 4 other funds. I think it's interesting to note. One was named after Dolph Briscoe and his wife. He was a great supporter of open government as governor. Bill Hobby, of course, as lieutenant governor, had similar influence and had the connection back to the Houston Post. Red McCombs, interestingly, for those of you who had never connected him back to the foundation, was not only very committed to open government, but put his money behind it. And then Bernard Rappaport, B. Rappaport, who was one of the most interesting and eclectic people I've ever met. You may or may not know he created a very successful insurance company in Waco, Texas, was a significant philanthropist there in Waco, and at one point was the owner of the Texas Observer. He didn't want to go out of business, so he basically stepped in and bought it and ultimately rationalized that. I'm not exactly how that played out, but well, Dave can tell us. Where's my bud? And that was, I think, an indication of how broad the support was for open government, open access, and all the values that the foundation supports. We were talking at lunch about how did all this get started, and I thought I might do just a couple of minutes on that. I promise this is not an oration, but it's kind of interesting how it came to be, and the time, the setting in which we found ourselves in the late 70s. All of you who had been in college or already in the workforce in the late 60s and early 70s knew how much visibility there was around various press issues. Some of it dramatic, some of it melodramatic, and some of that drama was deserved, but most of it, as we know, was not. But it was a very interesting time for all of us, and I particularly took away from the time I was at the Harvard Crimson interesting encounters. Think about this in the context of today's NSA. If you know anything about Ellsberg's past, there's an economic theory that he proved as a PhD student and early practitioner of economics in an academic setting that bears his name. It's quite an important premise. But at that point, he was obviously deep into the whole question of what to do with the Pentagon Papers. And between that and the other people of note who were around then, Tony Lewis was back in the States and in Boston, running the Boston Bureau for the Times. You may remember the name Tony Lucas, who was a different person than Tony Lewis, who was a great investigative reporter of that era. All of these people were around and talking about and trying to parse what is the right of the people, what is the right of the populace to know, and how do we provide for them the information that's important. So that I just use as an example of what was being discussed in journalistic circles all over the country, and certainly in Dallas when I came back, which led not to this epiphany that Paul described, but I'm happy to take some credit for that. It was a conversation that was ongoing, really. Some of it, as we would remind ourselves, happened more at Joe Miller's probably, Dave, than it did in some conference room. But it was very topical. And then, as I mentioned to Bob Mong earlier, as is often the case in Dallas or in Texas cities, a public figure did us a favor. Carl Thomas, the sheriff, not Cal Thomas, Carl Thomas, decided he was going to arrest one of our reporters, a fellow named Bruce Silverman. And as Paul and the members of the bar know, that led ultimately to an important decision in the Fifth Circuit about 3 years later as to the disclosure of sources, which is obviously not the same thing as FOI, but it's very closely related. So that gave us the impetus to take what was a very general conversation about how we dealt with public officials, how we dealt with government entities, how we dealt with various kinds of FOI issues, and put it in a more permanent form. I think there were 8 or 9 original incorporators, maybe 12, Dave. Dave McNeely and I were 2 of them. Tracy Rowlett was one. Dorman Cordell, where's John, ran the AP region here, was another. You'll all remember Bronson Havard. He actually played a prominent role both in the Society of Professional Journalists, which was aligned with all this, and then in the FOI Foundation. He sent me a great note. As some of you know, I do have files. And, I really don't disclose those to, well, there is no deal corporate anymore, so it's okay. So they're files, and I found the original files that I had, which are not complete, but touched on some of this. And Bronson at one point sent me a note. This is classic, a classic example of journalists trying to be organized. He was the president of the Society of Professional Journalists by this point. He said, "Dear Robert, we made great progress on all these different matters. I understand that the Freedom of Information Foundation received a check for $1,000 from the Press Photographers Association. Do you happen to know where that is? We can't locate it. Was it deposited?" So we then did the forensics on things like that. And after 3 years, we ultimately got all this done. It did not happen quickly, despite Paul's version, but it did happen. And what was this loose coalition converted into the foundation, and then as Paul recited all the good things that came from there. Just a couple of things to mention by way of futures and admonitions or admonishments. This is not a fight that goes away. It frankly becomes more complex by the day, as we all know. The existence of the FOI Foundation in a state as large as and important as Texas is, I believe, is really a significant accomplishment for all of you. Everybody in this room has had something to do with the creation of and the permanence of the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas, and we should feel very proud of that. I do, and Maureen does. There aren't many examples like this. I don't think there are any that are as fully developed as ours is, and certainly none that can recite, as Paul did, clear purposes for the foundation that can then be implemented or put into action on a consistent basis, and one that in turn earns the respect of our government, earns the respect and adulation of the citizens, because we are, as the Morning News, Kevin pointed out in an excellent editorial recently, we are only a small part of the equation. Actually, as the Morning News said in this editorial, the large majority of requests for freedom of information or freedom of information requests come from the populace, not from the press. So this whole mechanism for accessing what the government knows and how they know it is critical to democracy, and it is particularly so as things do become more complex. Transparency is a big word these days. I think we probably need to have a better understanding of what it should mean in a world of big data, advanced search. The amount of information that any citizen can access is astonishing at this point, and we probably need to define what exactly we mean by transparency, or help develop the understanding of that over time. The other thing I would say by way of observation, maybe commentary, is while the internet and the environment it has created insofar as information is concerned and how journalism is practiced is in so many ways remarkable and promising, ultimately, with so much information, I think the traditional hierarchy that has defined great journalistic organizations will become even more important, no matter where you find it. Is it going to be at 508 Young Street in the news department of the Dallas Morning News as we've known it, even know it today? Or is it going to be in some completely different form as all of this evolves, and it's evolving very rapidly? And when I say the hierarchy, this is all familiar to you, but just think about it. You've got this vast amount of information that is available instantaneously. There is no waiting time. I mean, even 10 years ago, you would have allowed a reporter 3 hours 3 days maybe to go find something. Now, so you got it? It's 30 seconds. Okay, that's right. Don't you have it? That's just the way the world will be. So how do you start out there? How do you assign our human resource, our colleagues, how do you assign their work? First of all, how do you choose what they're going to work on and how they're going to research things? What kind of fact gathering do we expect from them? I'd say that fact gathering will become even more complicated as the internet, which has no barrier to anything, including entry, becomes increasingly manipulated by individuals and other organizations. And then how do you put it into words or forms that we can all understand? And then the most important thing of all, editing. Who looks at that work and challenges the person who has prepared the work to be sure that it is factual, it is in context, it is fair to the degree you can assure that, and then how do you display it? That was pretty simple when we started the FOI Foundation. You know, there was something called the composing room in newspapers, and there were the editing bays in television stations. Now it's happening instantaneously in the field. So how do we keep those decisions about placement, display, emphasis, importance? How do we keep all of that in perspective or in context? It's a very challenging set of questions, but we know this, that if we have access to what our government is doing, and we have the ability to help make this definition of transparency, democracy will flourish, continue to flourish. And as so many of you have heard me say so many times, whenever you're feeling cynical about all this, you just have to stop and say, you know, we live in the greatest democracy in the history of the world, and we should be very grateful for that and do everything we can to protect it. And in this specific case, keep the work of the FOI Foundation of Texas going. And I thank you all for helping that happen. And Maureen and I are just extremely grateful for this recognition. Thank you.
I'm Russ Coleman of the FOI Foundation of Texas Board. And to further recognize Robert and Maureen, we are excited to announce today the establishment of a new FOI Foundation endowment in their honor. Income from the endowment will help fund our important programs, including seminars on open government and outreach programs promoting freedom of information. We are seeking at least $100,000 for the Decherd endowment, and Robert and Maureen are generously launching that effort with a $25,000 gift of their own. Plus a challenge grant by which the Decherds will contribute $1 for every $2 of new giving. So thank you very much, Robert and Maureen. So in total, we plan to raise an additional $50,000 by a target date of October 31st to fully realize this wonderful challenge grant. We're providing information to you now on how to participate if you so choose. We believe you can agree that maintaining open access to our government and protecting rights to freedom of information are very worthy causes. So thank you.